Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America. In recent years, many colleges have increased their efforts to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion, otherwise known as DEI. So how's it going? Joining me today in the studio is Errol Olton, Associate Director of Academic Innovation and Career Success at Guttman College, and Dr. Marcus D. Allen, former Program Director for United Men of Color and Political Science, tenured full-time professor at Guttman Community College. And joining us by Zoom is June Cross, author and filmmaker, National Emmy and Peabody winner, and tenured professor at Columbia University, where she founded the Graduate Journalism School's documentary program. And thank you all so much for being with us today. This is, I think, the perfect time to talk about DEI. As many people recall, when Nikole Hannah-Jones, the award-winning reporter and professor, was denied tenure, and we will talk more about that, at UNC, after releasing the 1619 Project. There was that incident, and more recently, Harvard President Claudine Gay, the first Black woman president of Harvard University, resigned under pressure. The allegations against her were failure to deal with anti-Semitism on the campus and some instances of plagiarism in her research. Now, among those who suggest that something bigger is happening here is op-ed columnist for the New York Times, Charles Blow. Let's hear a little bit about what he has to say about this.
Claudine Gay was not forced out because of anti-Semitism. Harvard had already dealt with that issue. Claudine Gay was not forced out because of missing citations or plagiarism. Harvard has a process for dealing with those issues. Claudine Gay was forced out because of mounting outside forces outside the academy who are engaged in a generation-long project to dismantle and destroy all efforts towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. And at a moment when Black women are ascendant in the culture, people like Claudine Gay represent and epitomize that diversity, equity, and inclusion, and so they have become the targets. And you can see this in all forms, from Kamala Harris to Ketanji Brown Jackson to Black women mayors of cities to Black women leaders of companies. This was never about holding Claudine Gay accountable. This was about vengeance from those who look at Claudine Gay and see a progress that they dislike.
Wow. Well, there's the inimitable Charles Blow. We have with us the inimitable June Cross, Radcliffe graduate, knows the campus, knows university life. What do you think about what Charles has to say? June.
I'm in no position to argue with Charles Blow, and I actually couldn't agree with him more. As a Black, I was at Harvard many years ago, but it's not a very welcoming place for anybody who's not, WASP oriented, really. It has become more inclusive in recent years, and I think there's a backlash against that because the way that DEI has been framed in this country, it's been a zero-sum game as opposed to a multiplier, an amplifier of the talents of the many game. So what we've got is a situation where Claudine Gay's colleague, Alan Dershowitz, can be accused of plagiarism. Doris Kearns Goodwin, who's a biographer of presidents, can be accused of plagiarism and still continue with their careers. And, when a woman of Haitian descent is accused of plagiarizing not the content of her quantitative and very thorough data research, but her footnotes and the methodology and some things in the methodology of how she approached her dissertation. There are calls for off with her head. So, this is very much an Alice in Wonderland moment.
And June, do you think that this is something that started some time ago? It's not something that
Oh, for
started
sure.
last
I mean,
month.
I think there's the whole attack against what we might think of as the liberal agenda. Really begins with the Brown v. Board decision back in 1954. The Koch
Wow.
brothers, the
50,
father of the
54 years.
yeah. And then, as the Great Society created things like the Environmental Protection Agency and OSHA, these the business interests, particularly those of the Koch brothers, Koch, brothers, who felt that this was going to interfere with their money, profit, and earnings, began an effort back then that has we are seeing the fruits of their labor now. So as long as the so-called liberal establishment has been trying to advance democracy for all, there's been a counter revolution going on in the background. I don't think anyone paid attention to until Trump's ascendancy in 2016.
Marcus, do you agree with Charles and June that this is something that's been afoot, or how do you? You're a tenured professor. You've made it in academia. I think the numbers of black faculty across the colleges are what, 6 or 7%, and tenured probably much less than that.
Yeah, I certainly agree with Charles and Professor. Part of this is really about gatekeeping and making sure that you don't have a space within these sort of power domains, if you will. And so when I think about this, 1954 was certainly, I think, part of it. When you think about the attacks on adding Black studies or Latin American studies as part of the sort of educational curriculum, or even at one point when I was at Binghamton, when we were thinking about how do we sort of challenge sort of Western civilization by thinking about adding courses that dealt with things outside of Europe. So this has just been an ongoing attack that they've been trying to make sure that we stay on the outside, as opposed to understanding that part of this is that we have to be inclusive. When we think about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it's not something that is just for a certain group. It is for all of us. Our founding fathers knew and understood the basic ideas of humanity. What they chose to do was to deny and turn a blind eye to that basic humanity when it came to application of those who were not part of the Western Europe framework.
Yeah, so Errol, I mean, Charles is saying it's not just higher education, it's across the board. But your experience in higher education in terms of the retraction for this, because certainly we all know, we've heard DEI, even if we didn't know what it meant, right, or precisely how people were going to employ it. We're familiar with the term and the effort. Yeah. And now that there's a retraction, your experience?
Well, I think we, especially in the Black community, have known DEI long before the acronyms or the term was there, right? Like we knew what it was like to not feel included, or when we were included, not to feel like we belong, right? Looking at Dr. Gay's the challenge there, it's frustrating because anytime minority in gender or race attains a position of power or influence that's traditionally held by white males, usually there's an uneven level of scrutiny placed, and it's unfair, right? And so we're looking at the little tidbits of, the little minutiae of their work, trying to criticize this and that. So, I think that is an example that I think the nation is looking at, but it's an example that exists within our workplaces. It exists within the various workforce fields out there.
So where is the help for all of this, June, in terms of, in some of the literature they talk about the excess pressure on Black professors, Black teachers, period, that not only do they have to do their research, their work, they are often put in the place of doing the DEI, who is there to monitor this to help Black professors?
Us.
No one.
We are. Yeah, right. We're there. We're there to. I mean, this is in part a failure of organizing and a complacency that I think arose among those of us who achieved a certain level. I remember I come of age along with the civil. I was actually born in 1954. Anyway, so I'm in that boomer generation. Came of age during the civil rights movement, and I remember during the 70s, a lot of us thought, "Oh my God, I thought we fought these battles in the 60s, and we won, and we're done, and we don't have to keep fighting." And in the 70s, it became clear that we had to keep fighting, and in the 80s, it became clear that we needed to continue fighting because that's actually when the first debates around what was then called affirmative action began. In the 90s. We're still fight. We thought we had won again. And then the aughts come and we're still fighting. We're trying to increase. When I joined the faculty at Columbia Journalism School in 2000, there were 17 tenured faculty throughout the entire University of Columbia. At one point we were joking that we could have a house party and fit comfortably inside somebody's living room. And now we're up to 10%, but there's been two battles being fought simultaneously, one to increase inclusion and the other against increasing inclusion, which used to be called, by the way, affirmative action. And I find it interesting that they're no longer using affirmative action. First, they conflated First they conflated critical race theory with DEI, and now it's been an attack against diversity, equity, and inclusion. And nobody even uses the words affirmative action anymore, I think, because,
maybe the Supreme Court? I don't know, No, but, that affirmative action has fallen out of use as a term. And so it is DEI after critical race theory, because that was on the lips of everyone for quite a while. I want to ask specifically, though, about Black women. Antoinette Candia Bailey, who was the vice president of student affairs at Lincoln University, who ran into an issue with one of her seniors, her bosses, and got into a conflict, was told that her contract would not be renewed, and committed suicide. Now, her family draws this conclusion, we don't know, but we can say what a sharp event to take place because of her feeling of failure in the university setting. Is this something that you think is particularly unique to women, Black women? It's what Charles Blow talks about as well. Black professors generally, but particularly Black women. June, what do you think?
I think it just takes a lot of courage to be a Black woman anywhere you are. Lincoln is a Black university, I'm assuming that the president of Lincoln is Black. So I don't know the particulars.
Her superior was not Black, though. But
okay, that's the person that I'm sorry, I'm not as familiar with that case. Right. I think it's hard to be a Black woman. It's hard to be a Black man. It is hard to be Black in America, okay? Immigrants come here no matter where they are from, and sooner or later they find a way to sort of join the mainstream. And, Africa, that road, and even Black immigrants come here and find a way to come in. And the forces on the right would like to say that that's because there's something inherently wrong with Black Americans. As a Black woman, people ask me about this, and I say I never expected any help from anyone. I have always known I was going to have to rely on myself, and I didn't expect to be welcomed. I didn't expect to be included. I had to make a space where there was no space. I don't know what that says. No, I know some of my other colleagues have not had that experience, and maybe it's too much of my own. I sometimes wonder, is it just the way I have of being? But I think no matter what gender of Black you are, it is hard being Black in America.
Right. Marcus.
Yeah, I could not agree more with what Joan has said, because I think part of this is really understanding that the Black community itself has always been under attack. When we think about the idea of intersectionality, and when you think about race and gender, you're going to go after the Black woman because she is the foundation, element of the community. She has been a pillar of the fight for civil rights and for advocacy. So when these women are actually ascending to these types of positions, one way that you are able to cultivate angst against them is to go at the core, at the heart of these women. I grew up in rural Alabama. My great aunt who raised me was born in 1906, right after, these really tragic decisions in the court. So here I am, a kid in her living room table, her dining room table, and she's teaching me how to read. I understood then at that moment, growing up in the rural South, the importance of education, because it was a woman who gave me that foundation. And they have always been there. I mean, much like June, I don't anticipate anyone giving me any help at all. So there has been this sort of internalization that I have to do this myself and think about the talents that I have been gifted by being alive and figuring out how do I use those talents for my own personal benefit, but more or less for the benefit of the community. I mean, that's one reason why I became a professor, is because of that joy of learning and because I understood and still understand the importance of the role of education in liberation and freedom.
And we were talking about some of your students and the impact that you've had on them, some of them in elected positions.
Oh, yes. When I was at Wheaton College, one of my former students, Lindsay Powell, is now representing, is part of the state representative house in Pennsylvania. One of my former students, Gabe Amo, right now is actually in Congress. And so here you have these type of experiences that I'm sure they would have made it anyway. But I think the focus and having the attention and the presence of faculty of color played a really pivotal role in their ascendancy and maintaining in a predominantly white institution.
No, Errol, it's 2024.
Yeah.
I mean, we would hope that your generation would have an easier time of it. I don't think you think that.
Well, to build on some of the earlier points, right? As racism and any isms continue to evolve, so must the ways we respond to them, right? And so we see, of course, we're in another technological boom, and racism and the other isms are ever present there. And so must our ways of responding with advocacy, monitoring. And so you just see this, it's like a pendulum that's swinging, right? So there's some advances with DEI across the nation, and now that pendulum is trying to swing back with the undoing of that, the undoing of what's being taught in schools. Some of my work and study these days have been focused on workplace culture and how one shows up in the work, right? To be a minority in gender or a minority in race, and to be anything that's considered other by a majority, right, in the workplace can be incredibly lonely, right? You learn to be self-sufficient, you learn to trauma bond sometimes, but it is incredibly lonely, and it unfortunately can lead to suicide. It can lead to the pressures of having a position that is nationally recognized and talked about in the New York Times, and then being forced to step down. Right? That's unhealthy. And I looked at, going back to Dr. Gay, I looked at her resignation letter, that note that she sent, and if you just read it closely, she's talking about some of the emotional challenges that now come with that, the threats that were coming and the pressure to step down. And so, yes, we look at the headline of it, but looking at the person and relating that to our everyday experiences and the different roles that we've had across the different institutions, it can be incredibly lonely and disheartening if you're considered other.
June?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I thought Dr. Gay's resignation letter was incredibly poignant. I think there's one other factor that we haven't talked about, which is the donor, the sort of the increase in donor activity. I mean, the people who give these vast amounts of money. I mean, I think Harvard lost something on the order of $400 million in contributions after Dr. Gay's disastrous testimony before Congress. It wasn't just her testimony, of course, it was MIT and Penn all of them supported by the same law firm. I just think, what was it, Thomas Paine that said the first thing we do after the revolution, let's kill all the lawyers. Um,
Right, right. We all have to come to the conclusion that whoever had prepared the presidents of those colleges, of Harvard and Penn, did not do a good job. So it's
Well, they come up with
exactly. So
lawyerly excuses for unmoral and
Right.
unethical things. I mean, of course, advocating genocide against Jews should be
of course.
it's something
You know.
that you should be called on the table for.
But it was
And
so clear that they had been given, and you could hear somebody, whoever the lawyer was preparing them, no matter what they ask, you say
Yeah.
this, and they were following orders, and they did not literally hear, I think,
Yeah.
the question that they were being asked, or the answer that they were giving, which
Yeah.
was ridiculous.
Yeah.
So I think it's right, but here's the deal that universities have made is that, their auditoriums and their football fields and their buildings are all named for donors.
naming opportunities.
Right, the naming opportunities.
Naming opportunities.
So-
And when your name is on the building or your name is on the door, you expect to have some influence on what goes on behind those.
Exactly, and now the donors are participating. It's not just my name on the football field, but I want to say who's the president, and now I understand that there's some discussion at Harvard of who's in charge of doing the investigation over, the charges of anti-Semitism. There's no agreement on that either. I guess the head of Jewish studies there is not.
The chair of the department, I think he's the chair of the department.
Chair of the department, right, is apparently.
And Mr. Ackman, who
You're right.
was the leading the charge against Claudine Gay. I didn't even know that you could write a 5,000 word post on Twitter, or what was Twitter anymore. But, Mr. Ackman, who was posting
I think
all
that
of
was
these.
that might have been an exception. It might have been an exception. So how do you feel about? I mean, you're both at a city university, part of our system of city university. So this whole idea of who is in charge, is that something that that comes into play when they're talking about what courses are being taught?
I think it always is part of the conversation in terms of who's in charge. I think part of it is related to there's a core curriculum that you want to follow. So, but there's also, I think, an opportunity to think about how are we going to respond to this multicultural democracy? How are we going to make sure that students sort of see themselves in the curriculum? How, for example, as a political scientist, how do I teach American government and politics in a manner that allows my students not just to see the theory, but to understand that their bodies themselves is about the sort of political discussion? And that's really what all this stuff is all about. When we think about these donors are typically white men. They're part of the class. And so there's a protection that is going on in terms of trying to figure out how do we keep these other conversations and voices out of amplifying and talking about our students and sort of sharing that history. The problem is that when you deny your history, you really can't have a forward movement, a future, if you're thinking about how do I stay in the past and ground it in the ideology itself that was based upon lies and falsity. Part of this is really about, I think, sort of truth-telling and coming to grips with this idea that we're all are created equal. If we're going to honor those things, that means that we have to have a real serious conversation about power, about access, and about education, and sharing that knowledge as opposed to hiding behind that knowledge. It's really interesting when I think about what lynching did and how a little kid was able to see that and witness that and have that celebrated, but can't learn about that in school or learn about the intersectionality in these different types of groups. I think part of it is that we need to understand that we have to move forward and take ownership of that past. And right now, I think a lot of people are not trying to take ownership of that past.
So we're in this battle, Errol. Who's winning? Does DEI actually work? Has it worked?
I think it's working, but I think that it will never go unchallenged, right? I think that when we think about the evolution of it, and we must not back down from just in terms of policies at an institutional level, laws, or just like day-to-day making sure that classroom instruction resonates and reflects the students that are listening and learning from it, right? So I always say it doesn't take one thing, it takes a blend of things, right? For us, and also it takes the minority population realizing, you know what, power is always at play, money is always at play, and we have to learn that and then use it for our own benefit to advance our own causes and our own, agenda to have our history taught and not erased.
Yeah. Marcus, closing quick statement about how we win this?
How we win this is by not being apologetic about it. I think part now what people are doing is they've been apologists for advocating for truth and clarity to come out, so we as a society and really as a world can really move forward. And until we begin to own that, that's going to be a part of a central problem. So don't back down.
June?
You asked me earlier about what's the solution to this, and I think we as African American scholars and African American people working in the academy have to organize among ourselves and agitate. And in some cases, it may take uniting with the students who are of like interest and all of us getting together. And as Frederick Douglass said, agitate, agitate, agitate.
There clearly is so much more work to do. My thanks to Errol Olton, Dr. Marcus D. Allen from Guttman Community College, and June Cross from Columbia University, who joined us via Zoom. Thank you all so much for your input and for the work you do every single day in your work. That is it for us at this time. Thanks so much to you for joining us. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America. We'll see you the next time.